Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first edition fall 2024 of OpenITI Conversations. I'm here with our first guest of the semester, Theo Beers. And in this first segment of our conversation, Theo is going to be talking about his work with Kalīla Dimna and how it kind of intersects with the digital humanities and manuscript studies and a bunch of other fun things. So, Theo, if you want to introduce yourself briefly and then get right into it.
Sure. So again, my name is Theo Beers. Right now, I've just moved to Philadelphia. I took a job at Drexel University, and mainly in the College of Engineering, where I'm working as a kind of have a hybrid position where I'm a research software engineer, helping people in both the College of Engineering and the College of Computing and Information Science at Drexel with how to write and deploy software and how to run servers that they need for scientific computing and all things like that. But I have kind of let's say a research foothold of my own here, where I'm given the time and autonomy in my new position to continue pursuing my own projects and collaborations, one of which is my continued, though now kind of external affiliation with a project in Berlin at the Freie Universität Berlin, focusing on the textual tradition of Kalīla and Dimna, the classic book of fables. And so before moving here to Philadelphia, I was in Berlin for almost, I think, 5 years, working at the Freie Universität on a few different projects there, some of them more let's say more specifically DH oriented, but the main project that first brought me there is the one led by Beatrice Grundler, a professor there on Kalīla and Dimna, and especially with a focus on the Arabic textual tradition and manuscript tradition of Kalīla wa Dimna. And so I still am actively collaborating with that team. I'm have a meeting with them tomorrow. Although some members of the team, especially as the project has moved on past its original ERC funded stage, some members of the team have moved to other countries or other cities within Germany, moved on to other things, but we still meet regularly. Some of them are still in Berlin, and we still have an ongoing collaboration. So I'll be speaking a little bit about the Berlin Kalīla wa Dimna project as kind of a case study in what are some problems that people in a field like classical Arabic literature are confronting these days. What's the need for DH tools and methods, and what kinds of DH tools are people developing and using in an actual project like this? What are and sort of the range of different, though mutually completely valid approaches that can be taken, with DH being almost the biggest tent imaginable, right? Or it's hard to think of anyone in the humanities these days who's not also in the digital humanities. So it is as
There
the one
might
is
be
as big.
somebody somewhere,
Yeah,
but we won't know anything about them. So
right, exactly. Yeah, that they will either we won't know anything about them, or the people who've refused to work digitally will be the only ones who have their work
yeah,
survived after some coming
possible.
Terminator scenario.
Hold up in a cave somewhere, which I
Yeah,
have occasionally thought about doing if I were single. I don't
yeah.
know. Cabin in the woods.
Well, it's you always have to wonder, like, is it going to be only the printed materials that survive, or is it going to be only the widely distributed digital materials that survive? It's hard to think of which scenario is more likely. Anyway, so should we kind of just get right into it, you
Sure, yeah.
think? Okay, so I'm going to share my browser window. I don't have slides, and I just want to show it. I only have a few tabs that I'm going to go through. Let me see. Zoom is requesting to bypass allow for 1 month. Okay. Sorry about
Good.
that. If you guys saw that disclaimer that Mac OS wanted some extra permission here. But yeah, like I said, the project that I have just left now less than 2 months ago, is at the Freie Universität Berlin. It's now really just called the Kalīla and Dimna project, but the original ERC funded name of it was Anonym Classic. And the kind of impossibly difficult problem that Professor Grundler wanted to solve, and for which she wrote the ERC grant application and ultimately got it. And then she also got a Leibniz Prize. So she collected in the mid 2010s all of this big funding that she was then able to use to assemble this team. The problem that she wanted to solve really is of a text that is at once one of in an undisputable way, one of the most famous, one of the most classic works of pre-modern Arabic literature and pre-modern world literature, generally speaking. But let's say, especially within the Arabic tradition, Kalīla wa Dimna holds an incredibly important status. It was written, or it was translated into Arabic from Middle Persian around the year 750 Common Era. So in the second Islamic century, 8th century Common Era, as far as we know, attributed to an author, an intellectual named Ibn Muqaffa. And it immediately gains this status as arguably the first, depending on your definition of book, like maybe the first Arabic book of belles lettres. I don't know. It's difficult to come up with the exact terminology to express how innovative and how central Kalīla wa Dimna is relative to what fairly little we have of, let's say, larger scale Arabic literary production prior to this early point, this moment of transition from the Umayyad Caliphate to the Abbasid. And anyway, early authorship date, immediate fame, extremely high degree of importance, widely copied, widely read, translated into every other language that Arabic came into contact with, including being translated back into New Persian repeatedly throughout the medieval period. Wow. But despite this incredible fame and centrality of Kalīla wa Dimna within Arabic literature, there's this huge problem with the text, which is that we don't have any extant manuscripts of Kalīla wa Dimna, at least of let's say the whole work or anything close to the whole work from before the 13th century CE. That is the 7th century Common Era. And that's a pretty big problem when you have a nearly 500-year gap between the authorship of a work, or what we think of as the authorship time of a work. We don't even really know exactly what year it appeared originally. We know actually kind of surprisingly very little about the circumstances under which Ibn Muqaffa wrote his translation, whatever. Set all that aside, we have this almost 500-year gap between authorship and the earliest extant copies. And even then, some of these 13th century manuscripts, the dating of them is debatable, and it's based on things like paleographic issues or the type of paper, the type of ink that was used on art historical grounds. So I think we only have actually one dated 13th century manuscript of the Arabic Kalīla wa Dimna. And then you're really talking about the 14th and 15th centuries when the number of extant copies starts to spread more. But the huge problem is that by the point that we get these copies, 500 plus years after the authorship of the work, the degree of variation among different copies is enormous. And this makes it, I would say, unusually clear to people who've worked on the history of Kalīla wa Dimna, people who've worked on projects to edit the text. It's been unusually obvious in this case that any idea of reconstructing an ur-text is ludicrous. And so no one really, at least of the people who have actually made editions or new kind of published versions of the Arabic Kalīla wa Dimna, there has never, to my knowledge, been a pretense of this is, in an authoritative way, the closest we can get to the original text. Instead, what the different editors of Kalīla wa Dimna have done, there's been a range of approaches. Abdul Wahhab Azzam, who produced an edition in the early 1940s with a nice foreword by Taha Hussein. Azzam's edition, he just uses the oldest available manuscript, this one dated 13th century copy. So it's like, the best we can do is to use this one manuscript and then fill in from others where there are gaps. Another earlier edition by French Orientalist Louis Cheikho from the beginning of the 20th century used another one of the earliest copies. And a few years ago, there was just a new edition and translation of Kalīla wa Dimna that came out through the Library of Arabic Literature series. And the editor, in that case, Michael Fishbein, just chose another nice, not early but not late manuscript, one from the British Library that we think dates to the 15th century. It's not notably early, but it's a nice, clean copy, and it provides a text that he liked. And so it's another totally valid response here is to set aside the whole aim of having anything that has a special authority because of the earliness of the base manuscript, and rather just to say, we'll do the best that we can with a manuscript that seems to be a fair representation of what the Arabic Kalīla wa Dimna may have meant to a lot of people in a certain era, let's say in the 15th century. So there's this range of approaches, but no one really has even been able to pretend that what they can do is to gather all the earliest manuscripts and come up with the most authoritative, closest to the ur-text version. And Beatrice Grundler obviously did not want to do that either. What she wanted to do was to use the opportunity of being in this DH era that we're in order to just pursue a radically different course. And so what she imagined was, let's gather a group of researchers, mostly Arabists, but also people working on some of the other important languages like Syriac, Persian. She's had people collaborating with the project who work on Sanskrit. So put together a good team, gather as many of these manuscripts as we can in digitized form. Just, that being plenty of times we did go and members of the project did go and work with manuscripts in person. I mean, there's nothing against that, but the idea was always to gather photographed copies of as many of these manuscripts as possible for the team in Berlin to work with. And by this point, the project has gathered well over 120 manuscripts. I don't know what the exact total is right now. And that's just of the Arabic Kalīla wa Dimna. And of those, there are, let's say, a couple dozen that we've worked with special focus for one reason or another. Early manuscripts, ones that are noteworthy in some way as to their textual contents, or ones that have really interesting illustrative programs. So there's a smaller subset that have seen extensive research from the team, but well over 100, well into the three figures, manuscripts we've collected from libraries all over the Middle East, all over Europe, manuscripts from the Vatican collections that we paid them to digitize. Really, you name it, we've gone out and tried to get it, with the goal of collecting digital copies of basically, I think the goal would be all Kalīla wa Dimna manuscripts from before the 18th century, or from before the 19th century. I'm not sure what the exact cutoff is, but anything that's even kind of pre-modern, what we think of as like the older centuries for manuscripts. Not the oldest, but even kind of in the old side. We wanted to get every single one of them, to put all those together, and then to build a digital platform that would enable us to transcribe the contents of some of those manuscripts, to load them into a database where we could compare side by side the contents of one manuscript to several others, from going from one kind of narrative unit of the text to another. And then, instead of thinking about, we're going to gather the manuscripts and generate the edition, that we could generate any arbitrary number of editions, in the sense of, I want to look at this one chapter in these 5 manuscript witnesses and see how they differ from one another and come up with something interesting to say about this. And that could be any chapter or any passage in the book. That could be any subset of 5 manuscripts, as long as it's been transcribed, to move the focus from one edition to an arbitrary number of editions, each based on whatever manuscripts are relevant to the reader or to the scholar for a given project at hand. And so that was the goal. And the project has generated a lot of scholarship. It's generated this now publicly available digital platform at kalilaandimna.de. Not it, I should say, far from everything that the project has done and is working on is available here. But this is now kind of the home on the web, where an increasing share of the editorial work that's been done by the Anonym Classic Kalīla wa Dimna project can be placed. And then, like I said, to build an interface that allows for these different comparative views of different chunks of Kalīla wa Dimna to be constructed and to be viewed. And we've been calling them collations. And for example, there's a chapter that focuses on the trial or the investigation of Dimna, one of the 2 title characters in Kalīla wa Dimna. The 2 main characters are jackals, and they live in a kingdom, a kind of primordial kingdom in nature, ruled by a lion. And Kalīla is kind of the good jackal, and Dimna is the evil one. And in the first main fable chapter of the book, Dimna schemes he basically orchestrates a cockamamie conflict between the Lion King and the lion's best friend, which is a cow or an ox, named Shenzaba or Shatraba, or different names depending on the manuscript. But Dimna is jealous of the close bond between the lion and the ox, and so he orchestrates a conflict between them that leads to the ox being killed. And then in the next chapter, and this is actually something that's new to the Arabic Kalīla wa Dimna, it didn't exist in prior versions of the fables in Middle Persian or in in Sanskrit or whatever. There's this chapter on a trial of in which Dimna is tried for and ultimately convicted of this treasonous act of setting up this conflict between the lion and the ox. So yeah, this just happens to be. I mentioned that an arbitrary number of collations, an arbitrary number of micro editions, whatever you want to call them, can be constructed based on manuscripts that have been transcribed by members of our team. And in this case, you can see there's a selection of, let me, seven manuscripts. I had part of my own screen blocked by the Zoom video thing. 7 manuscripts here, which are, and these sigla, I mean, you can look these up and these are listed in our materials, but we use shorthand because we know them. This is Riyadh 2536, Metropolitan Museum, A4095, that's Hagia Sophia. Or no, maybe that's Sultan Ahmed. I should look that up. Anyway, it doesn't matter. We can look it up. It's the sigla are well documented. This is London 4044. This is the manuscript that Michael Fishbein used for his recent Lal edition translation. P3466, that's at Paris at the BNF. R247, I think, is another one from Riyadh, and then P5881 is another one from the BNF. But it doesn't really matter. These are the 7 manuscripts that Professor Grundler, I think, wanted for basis of comparison for her research on this specific trial of the investigation of Dimna. And so we have these texts transcribed, and we have an interface where they can be compared. And you see we have the texts themselves, but we also have other functions that we can use. Let me see, I want to get out of that. One of which that's very important is you can show the, for any little narrative segment from any manuscript, you can click this button to show, at least it should, yeah, it comes up eventually. You can show just that line, right, of that manuscript, and you can bring up a few of them. It gets to be a little bit, actually, it looks like it's just giving me one at a time right now. There's a few different views. You can also juxtapose this, but I must be in the view right now that only gives you one at a time. But you can, if you ever have a question, let's say, and this happens all the time in our meetings, oh, is this transcription legit, or any of these words unclear, or whatever, if you want to be extra certain of what you're looking at, you can always load these manuscript segments. Yeah, so there we go. And this narrative segment falls on 3 different lines of the manuscript in question. So here you can see at the beginning, وَهُوَ مَثَلُ مَنْ, and then it continues, يَطْلُبْ الْمَنْفَعَ لِنَفْسِهِ, blah, blah, blah. And then you go to where it finally finishes. John, do you have a question? I can't hear you yet. You've muted yourself.
Not to interrupt the flow of your thought.
No, not at all.
What was the kind of development process like for you guys? Because this is a fairly involved interface.
Yes.
It looks really nice. It's very user friendly.
The Anonym Classic Kalīla with Dimna project has been the beneficiary of having a really brilliant software engineer on staff for the entire duration of the project and continuing up to this point. His name is Mahmoud Qoza. He was a BA student at the FU, then an MA student. He finished his MA thesis, which is really brilliant. And I think he has not yet started a PhD program, but he's been at the FU through this whole time. And he's from Egypt, and he studied computer science and software engineering all the way back in his time in Egypt before he immigrated to Germany. And then he has an interest in both classical Arabic literature. Obviously, he's a native Arabic speaker and really extremely well educated, also Arabist and paleographer, etc. But it's just like a brilliant what we would call a full stack software engineer, where he took it upon himself to do everything from the database schema design to a variety of backend services to this front end that we're dealing with right now. I mean, I'm sure you can imagine when this page loads, each of these cells, right? Like this has this unit, the chapter title unit of the investigation of Dimna chapter from R2536 manuscript. So it can make a database query and pull the text. And then if you click the facsimile button, it has to call into another microservice that Mahmoud wrote, which then fetches just the part of the image of that page that has the line. And there's a whole other platform that kind of sits parallel to this one, where the actual transcriptions are produced and where the images of pages are, let's say, broken up into different lines and stuff. Just didn't want to show like too much at once. And also
Yeah.
that one is not, at least it's not yet publicly accessible, though the end goal is for everything that everyone worked on the project to be public. But yeah, so this is, you know, this is a problem that a lot of people in DH have discussed over the years, is how do you find people who are
Yeah.
good enough software devs to produce anything like this? How could you possibly pay someone enough at, you know, if they're working as like a research staff on a project at a university or something? B, how could you find someone who has the chops as a software dev, but also knows enough about the domain, let's say, of, you know, the Arabic script and Arabic literature and all the things that you need to know in order to produce a web app that has this nice, everything from the right to left orientation of the text, the typography issues, the fonts, the UI, all of the things that you would need to know. You'd need to know a lot about Arabic and Arabic manuscripts and stuff in order to do this. How could you find a person like this? And this is something that Cornelis van Lit wrote about in his book, Beyond Digitized Manuscripts. He has a really good book, and he's also the one who ran, or maybe still runs, the Digital Orientalist blog, online publication. And he talks about all these problems, the different models that people leading DH projects have found. And one of them that he refers to, he calls the blind leading the blind model, where there's like a total disconnect between the research side of the project and those who've been given charge over producing the software for it, and how difficult that can be. So Anonym Classic has been, in an idiosyncratic way, very, very lucky to have someone on staff through the entirety of the project who's, you know, a brilliant software engineer, but also a well-educated native Arabic speaker who has an interest in classical Arabic literature, you know.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, so that's, yeah. Anyway, I think probably by now, even just looking at this for a few minutes, like a lot of it is clear how you would work with something like this. I mean, we sit together as a team and we'll read, you know, one unit at a time and compare the different Arabic manuscripts. We can also compare this to versions of Kalīla and Dimna written in other languages. That's like the other side of the project. But yeah, there's the facsimile option. The other thing I wanted to show just before kind of wrapping up a little bit, because I know I've already spent too long talking, is we have this map view. And I know this is really small, and you can those of you out there who feel like viewing it yourself, you can look at it yourself. So you can zoom in as much as you want. But basically what this does is it flips the orientation where it shows manuscripts A through G, which are here horizontally. Here they're vertically, and it shows almost like in a timeline format the progression of each of these manuscript witnesses through all of the chapter, which here is divided into, it looks like about 360 of these little narrative units. And the idea here is to show which of those units, which are basically sentence level chunks of the text, which of them, which by the way, we had to define for ourselves. And there's an arbitrariness to that. Obviously, the Arabic manuscripts are not coming to us with these sentences demarcated in any way, right? I mean, we don't even get punctuation of any kind, let alone sentence or paragraph level divisions that are clear. But anyway, with these units that we've devised, which of them are present in which manuscripts. And so you can see moments where you can see units at which the manuscripts are in great consensus, like this. I guess it's unit 92, when the lion assembles his court and summons Dimna, where none of these 7 manuscripts lack this unit. It's there in all of them. Whereas we can go to others which are present in as few as just one of the manuscripts. And there's this kind of monologue that Dimna gives late in the chapter, but the only manuscript that has it at all is London 4044. And so this is just like an addition to the UI that makes it easy for us to view almost in timeline form how over the course of the chapter, how the degree of variation between one manuscript and others, or just let's say that generally the degree of variation among the manuscripts kind of waxes and wanes over the course of the chapter. And it also occasionally allows us to group manuscripts. It helps us to find manuscripts that have relationships with one another, where if you can imagine if you find if we find some of these units that are present in like a few, like this might be this is another monologue. This might be by Kalīla. I can't remember who's speaking at this point in the chapter, but there's this unit on how it's harmful it's a wrong thing to shield a criminal. And the only two that have this are I can't remember if this is Ayasofya Sophia or Sultan Ahmed, but it's in the Turkish Library of Manuscripts has it, and then Paris 5881 has it. So these are kind of things that could, and this is not enough to draw a firm conclusion, but could suggest a kind of textual relationship of some kind. And you really have to do a lot of research and look at a lot of examples to substantiate something like this further. But this would be a hint in the direction of there being some link between this A4095 manuscript and Paris 5881. And so it can enter a kind of a feedback loop process where, again, you would never want to look at something as trivial as, oh, this unit is present only in these two manuscripts, and make like a rock solid determination that those two manuscripts either share a source or one was copied from the other or whatever. You're not even close to that point, but it can just be a little bit of a hint in a certain direction that you can later take your research as a philologist if you wanted to look at trying to group these manuscripts and see which ones are related to which other ones. So yeah, we have these kind of tools that have been built into this UI that help us and help Professor Grundler, especially as the leader of the project, to identify things that might be interesting and might be worthy of further investigation. But that brings me to the maybe the main point that I wanted to make about the Anonym Classic Kalīla Dimna project. I know I've now spoken way too long, but what I wanted to say is, I think this is an example of a project where at the end of the day, if you look at the research that's being written and published out of the people working on this project, it is in a way a very traditional, a very analog almost philological research project. The goal here is not to take transcribed texts of a bunch of Kalīla Dimna manuscripts and put them into like a distant reading system or do computational analysis per se. Professor Grundler is a classically trained Arabic philologist, and what she wanted was to use all of the tools that we can find or build to have the best possible DH workflows and resources feeding into and building up the efficiency of what remains at the end of the day a traditional philological research project. So it doesn't, and that's one of the really big questions is in terms of how we define DH and what are the different types of DH research that can be done. So this is a good example of a project with a ton of DH infrastructure surrounding a kind of more traditional minded core in a way. Not that there's any hostility to any other types of approaches, or that anyone affiliated with Anonym Classic would ever disapprove of or discourage. In fact, Mahmoud, and I should say this, Mahmoud, the software architect of the project, has also done things like he built a custom GPT chatbot where he just fed the complete extant works of Ibn al-Muqaffa into it. And it's a thing you can use, at least if you have a ChatGPT premium membership. You can open his I can't remember what it is, like Kalīla GPT or Ibn al-Muqaffa GPT or whatever, or chat with Ibn al-Muqaffa, and you can ask him questions about, what would you say about such and such question from the standpoint of traditional Arabic Islamic wisdom or whatever. So we love these things. But what you're looking at right now is a DH infrastructure meant to support a traditional approach. And that's kind of one of the main things I wanted to say as far as people thinking about what does it mean to be a digital humanist? What range of things could it mean?
What would you say, thinking in those terms of this as a DH project that is geared towards, we'll say, traditional philological work? What do you think is the kind of the biggest, I don't know, takeaway or sort of productivity booster, or like, what's the biggest, like, maybe intervention that this project does for that kind of philological work? Do you see it as more, it's kind of a resource that supports like things that scholars might have already been doing otherwise? Or do you see it as a resource that also kind of shapes in a different way work that scholars might do, if that makes sense?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And kind of a little bit tangentially to that, but also I think important. There's the question, and it's been something that the team has talked about several times of would we still be interested in publishing, let's say, a variorum edition with a selection of of part of Kalīla with Dimna, take a chapter or two that we think displays interesting variation characteristics, and choose the set of manuscripts, and then publish it in a more static form rather than just giving you a URL that you can open up our web app and look at it. Which would in a way be a very clear output of the editorial project in a way that something like this can look more like a tool than an output. And this is something that we've kind of agonized over. Like, are we building something that is a research intervention in the study of Kalīla with Dimna, or are we building something that is a platform that others, or that we, but also others could use to produce the real research? You know what I mean? Like that's something that's something that's been a kind of maybe a topic of anxiety and repeated discussion. And I don't have like a clear answer on that. But what I would say is we always hoped, I know Professor Grundler always hoped that the answer could be all of the above, that she has her interests in things like the development of the early classical Arabic literary tradition, with Kalīla with Dimna being one of the most important constituents in that. And she has a book project that she's working on now, a lot of which revolves around this investigation of Dimna chapter in Kalīla with Dimna, and what it says about, for example, ideas of justice as they developed in early Islamicate society, and even what we can learn about this about trial procedure and evolving ideas of courtly justice and courtly ethics in early Islamic society. So, and for her working on a kind of traditional book project like that, this is just a tool that she can use, right? That gives her access to a really good interface to compare a whole bunch of different versions of this source text that she's studying. And then anyone else who was doing a project similar to that would also have access to it. So on that level, it is just a tool that is supporting research that could be done. But I think there could be a larger intervention also in terms of is the approach that we've taken with Kalīla and Dimna only applicable to Kalīla with Dimna? No, I don't. I think there are certainly other texts where something conceptually and methodologically similar to this could be fruitful. You know what I mean? Like you think about something like the Mu'allaqat, which is another this unbelievably classic, famous collection of early classical pre-Islamic Arabic poetry, which has a horribly problematic manuscript tradition, that people often just don't want to talk about. But that would be it could be another type of text where confronting head on the problems in the manuscript tradition and creating an interface, creating an application that would allow people to look at, here are the different witnesses for like Mu'allaqat Imrul Qais or something, you know what I mean? So there's certainly other texts where you could imagine people could use a similar approach. It would be fruitful for philologists working on really different parts of the Arabic or even other textual traditions. It's hard to imagine how many other works there are where looking at it through this lens could be useful. And we would hope, although it's often very, very difficult to actualize, we would hope that even our software and the code, once that's made fully open source, could be useful to people who would want to apply similar things to other ends. But that turns out to be it's often faster and easier to just write your own application, even if that's a whole other can of worms. But yeah, so there are hopes about impact that a project like this could make on different scales. And it's everything from digital tools supporting the specific research concerns of Professor Grundler and the other people working on the project, everything from that to, hey, Kalīla with Dimna isn't the only text that has this problem. And shouldn't there be more of this? Wouldn't it be nice to have these tools and approaches that could make us more sensitive to manuscript variation and the complex stories of how what we think of as major and sometimes unrealistically static works of literature, how we actually got them in that form and where they came from.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's maybe not really an answer, but that's how we think about it.
Yeah, no, that's these are very much things, that we're thinking about at OpenITI.
Yes.
Because I think this sort of story of a highly variable mutable text over the centuries is not uncommon, particularly in this kind of the adab genre. So
Right.
like we've done a little bit of investigation into like the Shahnameh traditions, and there you have just this insane amount of variability over
Right.
the centuries. And that's in a text that pretty much stays in Persian. I mean, bits of it get picked up in other languages, but if you're thinking about this not only in Arabic but also in like all of these other languages,
Yeah.
their iterations, it's just wild.
And the Shahnameh is a good example because I mean, there has been this obsessive interest in producing the best editions possible. There was that large Moscow edition project, and then there was the large one led by Jalal Khaliki Motlaq.
Mhm.
And yeah, and it's one of those where you wonder, like, okay, we have very finely crafted editions that were made over periods of years, if not decades, with tons of people involved and great expenditure of resources. And we're so lucky to have something like the Khaliki Motlaq edition of the Shahnameh. It's wonderful that we have that. But it would also be cool to have somewhere that people could go to explore, well, what are the variations among the key witnesses of the Shahnameh, looking at some of the important earlier manuscripts and some of these passages that have a lot of variation, like the introductory passage of the tragedy of Rustam and Sohrab, like has these very, very famous lines that did not make it into the most recent critical edition. So
No, and also later editions, when you get to like the 18th and 19th century, because the manuscript tradition continues, for a
yeah.
long time.
Right.
And in some ways, the variability becomes even more intense. I found this British Orientalist who was active in India in like the early 19th century. He wrote or produced an edition, I guess. And he writes in the introduction, he went around India looking for copies of the Shahnameh, and he was just outraged by so many copies that he found that he was like, did they even read this text? Because it's missing in his mind just huge
Yeah.
and essential components. And he's like, I don't think they even read it. I think they just got it on their shelf for fun,
Right.
for prestige or whatever. But you can see like this gap between how people in 18th, early 19th century India perhaps thought about manuscript texts and the way that an Orientalist was thinking about them and kind of what these two audiences expected to find.
Yeah.
They're
And
very
that's
different.
Yeah, and what you say is very apt. Also, it applies to Kalīla Dimna because one of the most sort of, I don't know what to say, agglutinative. No, what's the right word? One of the versions of Kalīla Dimna that we have that has most accumulated a bunch of stuff in it is the version put together by Sylvestre de Sacy in the early 19th century. And he was using some of these manuscripts that are now part of the BNF collection in Paris, but he really his attitude is almost like we need to make sure it's all in there.
Oh, there. That's I think closer to the yeah, the sort of the what would have been the predominant attitude in much of the Islamic world at the time. It's like, why,
Yeah,
more is better. Let's
right. Like, why would we want to leave out any stories? And
yeah,
then the mood turns by the end of the 19th century among Orientalists. It's like, no, we need the earliest
yeah.
or
We want the
original version of this.
yeah, which
Um,
is a whole other thing. But all right, well this is really cool. We'll put links to the project, of course, in the show notes and encourage people
yes,
to have a look.
people are very encouraged, and there's other stuff that we'll link to as well. I have this Kalīla Reader app that you can look at
That's
that
cool.
allows you to go chapter by chapter and look at tons of not manuscript versions, but published versions of Kalīla and Dimna in like 40 different versions, over a dozen languages or whatever. So we have made humongous amounts of Kalīla and Dimna related material available online, and we'll make sure links to that, or Jonathan, I guess, will make sure links to those things are put for people to browse. And we just all of us hope that this is useful somehow to people.
Wonderful. All right, well, thank you so much, Theo, and
Thank
we'll be
you.
talking again with you soon.